Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Have you ever had that moment at the table where everything suddenly grinds to a halt and people start asking geography questions? Wait, where am I standing? Is the door behind me or to the side? I thought the ogre was closer than that. Nobody's being difficult, nobody's checked out, everyone was paying attention. What's happening is that everyone is imagining a different version of the same scene. When that happens, tension drops, decisions slow down, and theater of the mind quietly collapses, because it becomes disorienting. That problem isn't unique to tabletop games. Film figured this out a long time ago. Today, I want to borrow a simple idea from film language, screen direction, and show how it explains why theater of the mind breaks down and how you can fix spatial clarity at your table without pulling out a map. So, grab a drink, get comfortable, and let's get this short lecture started. First off, this video is focused specifically on theater of the mind and the kinds of challenges that come with running scenes without maps or miniatures. Grids, tokens, and terrain are fantastic tools, and for many tables they solve spatial problems immediately. But that isn't what we're talking about here. What I'm interested in today are the groups who deliberately play without visual aids, either because they enjoy the flexibility, the speed, or the improvisational feel of purely spoken space. When you remove the physical map, orientation has to live entirely in language and shared imagination, which makes clarity more fragile and consistency more important. My aim here is helping those tables keep action readable, tension high, and decisions fast, while staying fully in theater of the mind. In film, visual language is the set of cues that lets an audience understand a scene without being told what to think about it. Camera position, framing, movement, and the way characters are arranged in space all communicate relationships, danger, and focus before a single line of dialogue is spoken. A low angle makes someone feel powerful. A long shot establishes geography. A tight close-up tells us what matters emotionally. None of this requires explanation because viewers have learned, often unconsciously, how to read these signals. There's also a set of informal rules, often grouped under the idea of screen direction. The concept is straightforward. Once the audience understands where things are in relation to each other, those relationships need to remain consistent. If a character is established on the left side of the frame and another on the right, the editor preserves that relationship from shot to shot. If someone exits the frame in one direction, we expect them to re-enter in a way that makes spatial sense. Movement has continuity. Space has logic. When those rules break, usually accidentally, the audience can get confused. They may not consciously notice what went wrong, but the scene loses clarity. Action becomes harder to follow, stakes feel less immediate, and tension softens. One of the most well-known expressions of this idea is the 180-degree rule, which warns filmmakers against crossing an invisible axis between characters. When that axis flips, left becomes right, pursuit looks like retreat, and allies suddenly feel misaligned. But the specific rule matters less than the underlying lesson. Orientation is fragile, and once it breaks, the audience has to work to reassemble the scene in their head. Film works hard to avoid that cognitive burden. At the table, this same problem shows up for a very similar reason. In theater of the mind, the game master is effectively acting as both the camera and the editor. You are deciding what the table is looking at, when attention shifts, and how the scene moves from moment to moment. You cut from one player to another, from action to reaction, from description to consequence. That kind of rapid shifting is normal, and it's part of what keeps play dynamic. The trouble starts when those cuts don't preserve spatial relationships. Unlike film, tabletop play doesn't have a shared visual frame. There's no screen holding everything in place. Every player is maintaining a mental model of the scene, and that model is fragile. It relies entirely on the game master's language to stay coherent. When positions shift without being clearly re-established, when enemies move without a declared direction, or when new elements enter the scene without reference to anything already anchored, each player's mental image begins to drift. They're no longer inhabiting the same space, even though they're still in the same scene. This is why theater of the mind scenes often feel like they lose momentum in the middle. Players often stop acting decisively. And at many times they ask lots of clarifying questions. Combat slows down, social encounters flatten out because orientation was lost. The players are trying to solve a spatial puzzle before they can make a meaningful choice, and that extra cognitive work pulls them out of the moment. What's important here is that this isn't necessarily a failure of imagination. Players can be very good at imagining spaces. The issue is that they're being asked to constantly revise those spaces without clear guidance. Every unmarked movement, every unanchored description, every quiet shift in perspective forces them to rebuild the scene in their heads. Over time, that effort adds friction, and friction can drain energy from play. So once you start thinking about theater of the mind this way, the solution becomes a little clearer. The goal isn't to describe more detail or to be more vivid. The goal is to preserve orientation. Just like film, tabletop play works best when the audience, or in this case the table as a whole, always know where things are in relation to each other, even as the action moves forward. Once you look at theater of the mind through this lens, a lot of common table problems suddenly make sense. A lot of breakdowns in spatial clarity don't come from a big single mistake. They come from small habits that quietly accumulate over the course of a scene. Each one on its own seems harmless, but together they erode the shared mental space everyone is relying on. One of the most common issues is introducing new elements without re-anchoring the scene. An extra doorway appears, reinforcements arrive, or an environmental hazard becomes relevant. But its position isn't tied to anything the players already understand. The information is technically there, but it floats. Players hear it without knowing how it relates to their characters, so they hesitate, waiting for clarification before acting. Another frequent problem is movement without direction. An enemy charges, a guard closes in, or an NPC backs away, but the vector of that movement is never established. Who are they moving toward? From where? Through what space? Without those cues, players fill in the gaps differently, and the scene starts to fracture. The action still exists, but its meaning becomes fuzzy. Perspective shifts cause similar trouble. Sometimes the game master's mental camera rotates without warning. A room that was previously described from one angle is suddenly being described from another, and left and right quietly swap places. Nothing was described incorrectly, but the frame of reference changed, and the players weren't brought along with it. The result feels like disorientation, even though no one can point to a specific error. There's also an assumption that once a space has been described, it's locked in. In practice, memory doesn't work that way. After a few rounds of action or a few exchanges of dialogue or combat, details blur. If the game master doesn't occasionally restate the core layout, each player's mental map drifts further from the others. The scene keeps going, but everyone is now navigating a slightly different version of it. None of these habits come from carelessness necessarily. They usually come from trying to keep the game moving. The irony is that the faster things move without orientation, the more play slows down. Confusion invites questions, and questions interrupt flow. Recognizing these patterns is the first step towards fixing them. The next step is learning how to preserve spatial clarity without turning theater of the mind into a map exercise. The good news is that fixing this doesn't require drawing maps, switching to grids, or adding layers of extra description. It's about treating space the way film does, as something that needs a stable frame. Once that frame exists, action can move quickly and freely inside it without anyone getting lost. It starts by establishing a clear orientation early in the scene. You don't need to describe every wall or corner, you just need a point of view. For example, you're standing in the doorway looking into the hall. The altar is directly ahead of you, the side passages branch off to your left and right, and the stairs are behind you. That single sentence gives players a mental camera to work from. As long as you stay loyal to that perspective, players should have an easier time tracking everything else that happens without having to stop and ask too many questions. Movement becomes much easier to follow when it's described as a vector instead of a vague action. Saying the guard advances leaves a lot of room for interpretation. Saying the guard crosses the hall from the far side, closing the distance until he's just a few steps away from you, tells the players exactly how the threat is changing. The same applies to retreats, flanking, and repositioning. The cultist backs away toward the stairs behind you. This immediately communicates intent, distance, and direction in one move. Re-anchoring the scene after a major shift keeps everyone aligned. If new enemies arrive, initiative changes, or the environment changes, a brief spatial reset prevents confusion from creeping in. Something as simple as you're still near the altar, the doorway you entered through is behind you, and the fire pit is to your right. This can save minutes of clarification later. These moments help to preserve momentum by keeping the shared mental image intact. Environmental landmarks do an enormous amount of work here. A single dominant feature can hold the entire scene together. A burning candelabra in the center of the room, a wagon blocking the street, a massive statue at the far end of the chamber. Once that element is established, everything else can be described in relation to it. The ogre circles the candelabra counterclockwise. The archer ducks behind the wagon, or the priest retreats toward the statue. All remain clear without additional explanation. What's worth noticing is that none of this necessarily adds complexity or verbosity. It actually reduces cognitive load. When players know where they are in relation to a few fixed points, they spend less mental energy reconstructing the space and more on making meaningful decisions. Orientation stays stable, tension stays high, and theater of the mind does what it's meant to do: support play instead of getting in the way. This is why theater of the mind works best when you think like an editor rather than a novelist. You're maintaining a consistent spatial logic so that cuts, movement, and escalation remain readable. When that logic holds, the scene feels dynamic and alive. When it breaks, everything slows down, no matter how exciting the situation is supposed to be. Once you start running theater of the mind this way, the role of description also shifts slightly. Description is about orientation first and atmosphere second. Mood and tone, of course, still matter, but they sit on top of a stable spatial foundation. Without that foundation, even the most evocative description struggles to land. A useful way to think about this is to imagine that every scene has a camera, even though there's no literal one at the table. That camera has a position, a facing, and a set of reference points. As long as you respect those, you can move freely. You can cut quickly between characters, zoom in on a moment of danger, or pull back to describe the broader situation. The players follow along effortlessly because the underlying frame hasn't shifted. This also changes how you handle improvisation. When something unexpected happens, say a spell alters the terrain, or a player takes a surprising action, or reinforcements arrive, you don't have to reinvent the space. You just place the new element into the existing frame. The floor collapses near the statue. The spell ignites the tapestries along the left wall, or more soldiers pour in through the doorway behind you. So now let's look at a Game Master's Guide to Screen Direction in Theater of the Mind. So your first tool is to establish a fixed orientation early. Every Theater of the Mind scene benefits from a clear starting camera position. Before action escalates, orient the players by choosing a point of view and anchoring the most important features around it. Phrases like, from where you're standing, or facing the altar, or behind you near the doorway, across the room to your left. These do an enormous amount of work. They quietly tell the table how the space is laid out without requiring a full architectural description. Once that perspective is established, treat it as your default frame. Left stays left. The door that was behind the party remains behind them unless they explicitly reposition. The altar that was ahead of them remains ahead. If you later decide the room is more interesting from another angle, you can change the frame, but do it openly by re-anchoring first. So a rule of thumb might be pick a camera angle and stay loyal to it. And this single habit can prevent most mid-combat confusion before it even starts. Your next tool is to declare movement as vectors, not actions. One of the fastest ways to lose clarity is to describe movement in abstract terms. The guard advances, the ogre charges, or the cultist retreats. They all describe what is happening, but not how it changes the spatial situation. So instead, describe movement as a vector. Where the creature is coming from, where it is going, and what that means for the characters. So, for example, the guard crosses the room from the far doorway, closing the distance until he's right in front of you. The ogre pushes past the overturned table and barrels straight down the center of the hall. The cultist backs away toward the stairs behind you, keeping the fire pit between you and them. This preserves three things at once: direction, distance, and threat trajectory. Players understand whether danger is approaching, circling, or trying to escape, and that understanding drives their decisions. Your next tool is to re-anchor after every cut. In film, editors constantly re-establish space after a cut. Tabletop play works the same way. Whenever the scene meaningfully shifts, it's worth spending a sentence to reset the frame. Good moments to re-anchor include things like when initiative circles back to the top, when reinforcements arrive, when terrain changes, when a spell reshapes the battlefield, when the party splits positionally. A re-anchor doesn't need to be long, just something like, you're still near the ritual circle, the door you entered through is behind you, and the stairs are off to your right. That single sentence keeps everyone aligned and prevents the cascade of clarifying questions that otherwise follow. Don't think of it like redundant description, think of it like maintenance. Just like reminding players of conditions or ongoing effects, you're preserving the shared model of the scene so the game can keep moving. Next is use environmental landmarks as visual glue. Film almost always gives the audience something solid to orient around. A car in the middle of the street, a staircase dominating a hallway, a statue at the far end of a chamber. Theater of the mind benefits from the same strategy. Pick one dominant feature in a scene and let it anchor everything else. A pit in the center of the floor, a blazing fire, a wagon blocking the road, a ritual circle, a collapsed pillar. Once that feature exists, describe most movement in relation to it. The archer ducks behind the wagon, the ogre circles around the pit, the priest retreats toward the statue, the cultists spread out around the fire. Players don't need to remember the entire layout if they can track how things relate to a single stable object. That landmark becomes the visual glue holding the scene together. Used together, these four tools quietly reshape how theater of the mind feels at the table. If you take one thing away, let it be this: theater of the mind works best when space behaves consistently. You don't necessarily need more description, and you don't need perfect realism. You need orientation that holds long enough for players to make confident choices. When you borrow that logic from film, when you protect screen direction at the table, clarity improves, pacing tightens, and scenes start carrying their own momentum. If you found this video useful, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in how different tables handle theater of the mind, especially in games that lean heavily on it. And if you'd like to see more ideas pulled from outside of gaming and applied directly to tabletop play, consider liking this video or subscribing. It really helps the channel and lets me know what's resonating. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.